over 1 million words. That's roughly what I sat down and calculated a year or two ago. 1 million words. Over the years that I've been here, each week I write an article for the bulletin. And you calculate out about how many words appear in an article, depending on if I use a cartoon or a picture or how large. But roughly figure 800 words. Then you begin to factor that out. And it clearly comes to 1 million plus. That's a lot of words. Words that are used repetitively, thoughts that are expressed, communicated, ideas laid out before you. Comprised in something over like 800 different articles over the years. I try not to repeat them. I'm sure there is sometimes a repeat message or two. But it is truly amazing what is communicated by and through words. You may recall that last week, or it might have been the week before, I had made mention in the sermon about a card that Linda and I had received. That on the back page of the card, the word, I forget, something publication, had been crossed out and then handwritten in Hallmark. And I talked about, oh, that was fun, and I enjoyed the joke in it. But how I appreciated so much the words that were expressed. This week we got another card from somebody. The words that were expressed said so much. Emails that were received spoke volumes, and I appreciated them greatly. Words, communication. In the men's class yesterday, we were talking about communication, talking about understanding and the onus falling on men to live with their wives in an understanding way and to treat her as you would a weaker vessel. We talked about weaker vessel not being that she's not strong, but that weaker as far as frail, as precious. And so we talked about all those levels of communication. And as we begin the lesson this morning, I want us to realize that that's what we're going to be talking about today, the realm of communication. But look at it from what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter and verse 1. Because Paul writes, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? We talked about that in class this morning as well in the book of Galatians. Or do we need, as some, letters of commendation to you or from you? Well, have you ever needed a letter of reference? Recommendation. Over the years, I've written a lot of them. Members of the church will come to me and say, well, we're going to do this or we're going to do that. I could use a letter of recommendation. And so I affectionately refer to those, oh, you want me to write a lie letter? No. I want you to tell the truth about me. And I look at him and I raise one eyebrow and I go, do you really want me to tell the truth about you? Do you really? And then I'll write the letter and it'll be very flowing and flattering. And I've received several requests over the years for those. Individuals that are going to adopt a child or go to a job or look for promotion or any number of things. Recommendation. So Paul's saying, do we need that from you? But look at verse 2. You are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men, being manifested that you are a letter of Christ, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. It's impressive, dynamic, powerful. And like it or not, we're read each and every day, each and every minute by others. Now this morning we're missing two important parts. Well, three. And many more. But Tracy's still not feeling well. And my wife, Linda, she's not doing well today. Greg Miller, he's out of town. We could go on and on talking about the others. But by and through their absence, we miss them. We miss what they communicate by simply being here. But we miss the encouragement that they offer. Because each and every one of us is that communication that is sent by us to those with whom we interact. And so all of us are a unique letter, an epistle as it were. Mary Lee loves to read. Loves to read. I don't know how many books she reads a week. That's what I was told. We were waving back and forth to each other. She said she reads 5. I've cut back. I'm reading like 2 or 3 a week now. But reading is so important to me. If I couldn't read, I don't know what I would do. I would much rather read than watch TV. I would much rather read than do almost anything. I love to read. But as one who practiced psychology for a while, you also read people. You read what they say, how they say it. You begin to become in tune to body language. And unfortunately, sometimes that gets you into trouble. But what Paul is saying is really true. That we are read by our life. You are the only Bible that some people will ever read. Later on, we'll look at a little poem and share it with you. Because that's what we are. Look at what Peter writes back in 1 Peter, first chapter. And we're going to drop down at verse 17. Because Peter said, and if you dress as Father, the one who impartially judges according to each man's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay upon earth. So if you fashion yourself as a child of God, you're proud to wear that insignia, then by all means, having a conduct that is appropriate. Now, last night on that fabled TV show, and yes, I set aside my book that I was reading, tuned into Channel 23, much to Linda's chagrin, and watched The 5 Fingers of Death. Oh. Peter Lorre was in it. Oh, it was all in black and white. It was laughable. But one of the things that really stood out was the signet ring on the hand. And it was in it and on it, and it was an identifier. And then at the end of the movie, it was shown to be a fictitious image of a madman who perpetrated crimes. But the signet ring was important. It was the defining image. And that is exactly what we are. We need to bear that signet that we are children of God and live accordingly. That's what Peter's talking about. That's what Paul's talking about. You are letters of Christ. And so what Paul then does, in the very first chapter of his letter to the brethren in Philippi, you can see it on the overhead. Philippians 1 and verse 27. Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Later on in that letter, after he talked about if there is any consolation, any joy, any love, be of the same mind toward one another. That's as the second chapter opens up. Have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus. And then it goes on talking further about the manner of life that we're supposed to hold on to. Ultimately getting in verse 15, when he begins saying, that you may prove prove. Well, what's meant by prove? What do you do when you prove something? That is the determining factor of whether or not something is right or wrong. Remember when you were in elementary school, you were doing mathematics, and you were taught, well, here's how you do it. Here's how you do the problem. Now, to prove that, you then do this. And if you do it the same way, you add it this way, you subtract it this way, you're going to come up with the same answer. You multiply, then you divide. And you prove your work. Well, that's what we do with our lives each and every day. We prove ourselves. So watch what he fully says there in verse 15. That you may prove yourself to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. Goes on a little bit further. Holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may have cause to glory, because I did not run in vain nor toil in vain. That you may prove yourself, what? To be a light in the world. That beacon which shines out among all others. Because you are indeed a light in the world. And you are a letter of Christ. So that when individuals look at you, they're going to see something truly unique and truly amazing. There's a number of ways that we are read. I really like these Norman Rockwell kind of prints. They take us back to a simpler time and day. And yet, when you look at the picture, so much is communicated by and through his renditions. They're just still life, but they speak volumes. Our life is not still. Our life is active. But what people see in us communicates volumes. And so how do we communicate? How are we read by other people? Well, it's easy when you look at Peter. One of the ways is by the way you talk. In Matthew, the 26th chapter, verse 73, Christ is going through the rigors of that night. Peter is following away from a distance. The accusations are flying. You're one of them. No. Wait a minute. You are. Because the way you speak gives you away. There must have been something about the dialect from the region of Galilee that was heard by those in Judea. Oh, the way you speak gives you away. I mentioned the movie that I watched last night. And I told Joy and Janice about it because I know they wait every Sunday to hear what movie it was, what they missed out on. But the minute Janice heard what movie I watched, and she goes, oh, Peter Lorre. And she started doing the intonation of his voice. Because he spoke distinctively, menacingly. And that was his voice. The way he speaks gives him away. I mean, it was even evident in Arsenic and Old Lace, even though that was kind of a funny movie. But yet the way he speaks gave it away that he was sinister. The way Peter spoke, in essence, said that he was from the region where Christ was from. That he was undoubtedly a follower of his. And so what we need to do when we look at our lives is we need to be mindful of the way we speak and how it speaks volumes about us as well. Because the way we speak does give us away. James writes in James 1 and verse 19, let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. We need to practice that in what we do with our life. We need to be not calculating, but we need to be reasoned in our response and not quick to fly off the handle. We're willing to listen. We're willing to ruminate on what's said. And then, with fullness of thought, we then respond. It's one of the ways we communicate in our life and lay it all out. In Colossians 4 and verse 6, kind of an interesting passage, because it talks about our speech being, as it were, seasoned. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned, as it were, with salt, so that you may know how you should respond to each person. Understanding. Talked about that yesterday in class. Talked about it this morning in class. Seasoned with grace. Know what to say, how to say it, when to say it, and what to say. And people judge you on that very quickly. So that's one of the ways that people look at us, and we stand as a letter of Christ. Also realize that another way that we speak and another way we're read is by and through our actions. And yes, actions do speak louder than words, tremendously louder. Can it be said that in our work environment we're good employees? Look at 1 Thessalonians 4th chapter, verses 11 and 12. Are we good employees? Can our employers rely on us to do the right thing, no matter what? I quit a job shortly after I became a Christian. And it was a good job, but I quit it. Well, it was maybe not too shortly after I became a Christian, but it was a time after. And the reason I quit it is because part of what I was called upon to do was to write for chargebacks. The company and I would go buy the furniture and boxcar loads and whatnot. And then I would write back to the companies and say, we want a discount because this was damaged or that was inferior and so on and so forth. And my boss told me that's what I needed to do. And you know what? In all honesty, there wasn't that much damage. I mean, when Thomasville ships out a bedroom set, it is packaged beyond comprehension. And for me to write back and say, we want a discount because of this, I couldn't do it anymore. And part of my salary was based on what amount of kickbacks I got from those companies. And so I went in, I told them, Maury, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to quit because I can't compromise my principles. And he asked me a very valid question. Well, you were doing it for all these years. What changed? And I said, you know that I became a Christian. I will not do it anymore. And I quit. And I quit a really good job. And I went home and told Linda. And she said, what are we going to do now? And I said, I'll go into preaching. So we went from X dollars to no dollars. It seemed like that. But it was all right. We got by. But it was telling. It was telling. And I think one of the things that triggered it was my secretary. Because she said, you know, Bruce, I know you became a Christian. And what I like about you is you don't let anybody know it. And I thought, oh, that's terrible. And that weighed on me. And it weighed heavily. We speak so much by our words. So much. And those actions need to be consistent with what we say, what we do, how we do it. The absolute consistency needs to be there. Look what Peter writes in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, and down at verse 4. Because Peter is pleading. He said, "But let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God." Now, I understand he's talking to wives. I appreciate that. But I think that applies across the board. That we have the hidden person of the heart that's here. And we need to as well be mindful of a gentle and quiet spirit. And that doesn't mean standing back as a wallflower. But it means our life being consistent with what God puts out. Ephesians, the 4th chapter, verse 17 and following. "But you did not learn Christ in this way." Then he goes on talking about a change of mind, a change of heart, and have it consistent in all your life, every day. Every day that we are alive, we put that into practice. And how we're clothed with righteousness. How we move forward as a result therein. To be spiritually minded is life and peace. That's what Paul writes in Romans, the 8th chapter and verse 5. But it continues down for much more. Take the time and read that. Spend time absorbing the words. The same thing is true in Colossians, the 4th chapter, and verses 12 through 13. We're read by all of these things. We're read also by our interest in spiritual matters. I thoroughly enjoyed yesterday morning. I enjoyed listening to the men talk with their ideas. I enjoyed Jacob sharing his different thoughts on a couple of different passages. John's observations of passages, as well as Jason chiming in. It was great to be able to sit and share those things of a spiritual nature. It harkened back to when I first obeyed the gospel. And several of us would get together on just an impromptu basis. And we would listen and share different things about a spiritual nature. And it wasn't always just men. The women were there at times and talking. And we would talk long into the night. Midnight was not too late to still be talking about spiritual matters. It was so wonderful. And when we begin to share things like that, sharing that even exchange, it's glorious. And so when we have that desire and we're willing to sit back and just share because we have an aptitude and an appetite for spiritual things, may not always agree. But to have that desire is wonderful. And again, it speaks so greatly of the individual. A few years ago, Friday night, we had people over. I don't remember why, but we did. And the discussion turned into a rather interesting one. And it was Joy and Jacob and Linda and I at the table. Everybody had left. We sat and we talked. 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 3 o'clock in the morning came. No, it wasn't that late. It was wonderful. It was after midnight that we stopped talking. But I look back on that and I go, oh boy, was that fun. Because it spoke to the spiritual aptitude and desire to share. That's what we're talking about when we talk about being letters of Christ and how we're read by others. So we're read by what we say. We're read by what we act like. And whether or not our life is in alignment and comportment in our work life, in our social life, our family life. And then our spiritual life as far as studying and ingesting God's word. What's it like? What does it say about us? So what kind of letter should we be? We should be one that is easily seen and read. Sometimes people come to me and go, oh man, why don't you make the letters bigger on the overhead? I usually do them in 20-point font, 24 sometimes. Headlines are in 28. Sometimes I'll do it, in a little bit smaller or larger. But I understand what you're saying. Because now when I use my computer, I go and I'll open up either Publisher or Word or something like that. And whereas I used to look at it just at 100%, ooh, that gets to be a challenge. Now it's at 150%. I like that. It's easily read. It's easy to understand. I don't have to struggle with it so much. The same thing is true with us. It should be easy to read us and to be able to ascertain what we're trying to communicate with our life. On the overhead is that little poem I said we would look at. We are the only Bible the careless world will ever read. We are the sinner's gospel. We are the scoffer's creed. We are the Lord's last message, given in deed and word. What if the type is crooked? What if the print is blurred? That's our life. And that's what Paul is trying to get us to understand. It's truly impressive. Let me share with you another quick one. Christ has no hands but our hands to do his work today. He has no feet but our feet to lead men in his way. He has no tongue but our tongue to tell men how he died. He has no help but our help to bring them to his side. And then we are the only Bible the careless world will read. We are the sinner's gospel. We are the scoffer's creed. We are the Lord's last message, given in deed and word. What if the type is crooked? What if the print is blurred? What if our hands are busy with other work than his? What if our feet are walking where sin's allurement is? What if our tongues are speaking of things his lips would spurn? How can we hope to help him and hasten his return? So when Paul writes in that second letter to the church in Corinth, in that third chapter, first 3 verses, he is saying a mouthful. When he said, you are individually letters of Christ. And what is it that you are communicating? And yes, we should be easily seen and read. You can go back into Matthew, the 5th chapter, look at verses 14, 15, 16, where Christ is talking, discussing about the Beatitudes, how we are to be the salt of the earth, how we are to be the light of the world. We are to be easily read. I can look at you and I can see a Christian. I can see it in what you do. I can see it in how you talk. I can see it in your attitude of desiring those things of a spiritual nature. When we speak, we need to speak with boldness and clarity, not being wishy-washy. We need to speak where the Bible speaks and not be ashamed of it. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who would believe, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his name. And yes, where there is anything positive, where there is anything uplifting, I've got to focus on that. I've got to allow my mind to be there. That's what I've got to do. If anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things. Now, I don't want to be a letter of lewdness or unseemliness at all, as Paul talks about in the 13th chapter of Romans. Nobody should want that. Unfortunately, in the church, that's happened. And It's going to happen because we're comprised of individuals. And individuals have weaknesses and shortcomings. Nor do I want it to be one of idleness. Matthew, the 20th chapter, and verse 6. I don't want to be found idle. I want to be busy. I want to be doing as much as I can do. I don't want to neglect so great a salvation, as the writer of Hebrews points out in the 2nd chapter, in the first 3 verses. I don't want to be negligent at all. And in Romans 12 and verse 3 or in verse 16, I don't want to be arrogant. I don't want to be haughty. I don't want to be puffed up. I don't want to. Remember how we talked a few weeks ago about how Christ's blood speaks better than the blood of Abel? Truly it does. But Abel's blood speaks of obedience and of direction. And it speaks greatly. And he's been dead, we would say forever. Shortly after the beginning, he passed. But he still speaks. He still speaks. What does your life say about you? We're going to pass from this life one day. And what does our life say about us? Thoroughly enjoyed Thursday evening. We had a chance to visit with Jim and Kelly. And in our visit, we reminisced about Olaf and Lynette. And when I think of them, it's fond thoughts. Their life, what they stood for, still speaks to this day. It speaks volumes. In my mind's eye, I can still see Olaf in the back. In one of the recliners we had back there. His leg thrown over one arm, following along in the Bible. And then he would hold court after the services was over. He would welcome people to come back and talk with him and visit with him. Had a gleam in his eye and he was in dire pain. But he would talk to you about spiritual things and be able to quote book, chapter, and verse. He still speaks today. And you're going to still speak even after you're gone. But what is it going to say? Well, the lesson is yours this morning. Trust that you take a little bit out of it. Look at the passages we've made reference to. And then decide what you're going to do with the information that we've presented to you. Because life is all about being a letter of Christ. So let us not live in such a way that our life leaves a letter that is reflective of that which is negative. Women, I'm going to ask you something. Do you still have all the letters and cards your husband sent you? Yep. Linda has every card, every letter, every poem, everything I wrote. She even has the articles that I wrote for when I was being a reporter on a newspaper. And I was paid stringer wages, 15 cents a word. Whew, those were long articles. 15 cents a word. I thought, man, I'll write an article, I'll get rich. But every once in a while, she drags them out. Do you remember when? This is what you said when. Do you still feel it today? We hold those things dear. They're treasured. Your life is given to you to live as a letter for Christ. Is it going to be one that is treasured? Hopefully so. If you're not a child of God, we'd love nothing more than to sit down and study with you, to show you what it would take to become a child of the God of heaven. But maybe you already know what you need to do and you're willing to make your obedience complete by putting them on in the waters of baptism. If there's any way we can be of a spiritual assistance.